Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the second Wednesday series. Again, my name is Paul Millenbach, and with me today is Courtney Agrusa, who is an attorney in our municipal law practice group, who also does the labor and employment portion of the municipal law in that group, and is very well versed in labor and employment law, as well as Tony Dalimonte. You remember perhaps Tony from a couple of months ago, who spoke at this session and has spoken many times on the issue of ESTA and the fallout from that. And again, welcome back, Tony, for today's second Wednesday session for the amended Youth Employment Standards Act that was recently enacted. Before we get started, I don't like to tell a lot of boring stories, but when I was a kid, and maybe some of the older people on the cast here, you remember when you're a kid, you just went out and got a job, and your parents told you to go get a job, you went and got one, and if you had to work late, you worked late, and if you had to work in the morning, you work in the morning too. But apparently, that's not the case anymore. We do have Employment Standards Act, and it's probably a good thing. But can either one of you tell us what the Youth Employment Standards Act is?
Yeah, I can jump in. So just from a real general perspective, the Youth Employment Standards Act, or YESA, is Michigan state law regulating the employment of minors. So, decades ago, I think we had issues with minors working in dangerous jobs in our country. And so across the country, states enacted these youth employment standards laws to protect kids and protect minors. And it sets forth, work hours, types of permitted work, permit and registration requirements, and documentation obligations. But the underlying purpose of it is to, make sure that minors and kids aren't being taken advantage of.
Does it apply to all Michigan employers?
Yeah, so it's going to apply to, nearly all Michigan employers. Now, that includes state and political subdivisions, agencies. It includes industries such as retail, food service, hospitality, agriculture as well. Now, there are limited exceptions for certain family businesses. If you're volunteering at nonprofits, which we'll talk about, in certain volunteer roles. And there's some modifications based on age requirements as well. But in general, it applies to, just about every Michigan employer.
What agency is responsible for enforcement of it?
So that's going to be LEO, or the Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity in the state. LEO enforces our wage and hour laws. They are responsible, and we'll get into it, but they're responsible for administering the new centralized work permit registration system that's going to go into place in 18 months from now. But they are going to be the ones that are the sort of governing body here.
And the law was recently amended, correct?
Yes, so it was changed. The law was changed, and the changes took effect on April 2nd, 2025. And I know Courtney is going to get into the details of what those changes are. But in general, the changes modify the timeframes that kids of certain ages are allowed to work. And the other big change, which isn't happening now, but it's happening 18 months from now, or 18 months from April 2nd, is LEO is going to be the registration system in order to get a work permit. So right now, if you are 16 years old and you want to go work at the ice cream shop down the street, you got to go through your school district or your public school to get a work permit. That's changing in order to sort of centralize the system, and there's efficiencies of having a sort of central system. So October 2nd, 2026, you have to go get a work permit from LEO, not, the public school district or your school. So that's a sort of broad overview of the changes. But again, for the registration, that's not happening for 18 months.
We'll drill down on this in a little bit, but what is the minimum age for employment in Michigan? There has to be a minimum, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, go ahead.
go ahead,
No,
Courtney.
go ahead,
Sorry.
Tony. No, it's okay. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
So you asked what's the minor, or you said what's the minimum age requirement, Paul?
Yes.
Yeah, so yes, it applies to anybody who's under 18, right? And you see throughout the act that there's a distinction between how they treat 15 or 14 and 15-year-olds and then 16 and 17-year-olds. So that's probably one of the biggest changes that's going into immediate effect is how long kids can work between the ages of 14 and 15 and what days they can work and things like that, depending on what time of year it is. So that's probably the biggest change.
Could you explain that, what the changes are for 14 and 15-year-olds?
Yeah, so for 14 and 15-year-olds, they can actually work, they may only work during times that are outside of school hours. Before, I think that there was some flexibility. They can't work more than 3 hours per day, and that can't exceed 18 hours per week. And that's when school is in session. When school is not in session, they can only work up to 40 hours per week. The other big change is that before 14 and 15-year-olds could work, I think it was between 7 a.m. and 9 p.m. And now they can't work past 7 p.m. So that's a big change. And those hours are going to also vary depending on, again, if it's during the school year or if it's during the summer vacation. So that's a really big change. And I think employers need to be mindful of that because you're losing a significant amount of workforce, right? Because before kids could work anywhere between 8 to 10 hours a day. And now you're saying they can only really work 3, maybe 5 hours a day, right? On certain occasions. So you've got to be mindful of that. And then the fact that, again, that cap on when they have to absolutely stop working, 7 p.m. versus 9 p.m. So those are, to me, the biggest changes. Tony, did I miss anything there?
Nope, I think you hit the nail on the head.
Well, it certainly must have a big impact, a large impact on seasonal employers and seasonal employees for that matter. I would think a lot of places would be open in a resort town or a resort community, and maybe an ice cream shop or something be open till 9 o'clock, and now they have to send the young kids home at 7. Is that
absolutely? Yeah, but it is worth noting that the regulations for 16 and 17-year-olds did not change, so those hours will remain in effect. There is no variation there.
okay? And that's what I was going to ask the next question. What about 16 and 17-year-olds? Is there any change there?
No change there. If deviations are needed, they can be requested later on, like through Leo.
Now, this is kind of off the wall question, but not too off the wall. But is it if someone has a brother or sister that's one is 17 and one is 15, would that 15-year-old be allowed to work until 9 o'clock, or would that kid have to go home?
They would have to go home unless they got an approved deviation, and they can, like I said, they can apply for that deviation under very special circumstances in the very beginning, and then Leo can approve it or deny it. And even if they actually approve it, they can get some pushback from the parent or legal guardian of the minor, which I thought was really interesting. And if there's pushback, Leo will automatically deny the deviation request.
And the deviation request is something, is it a general, you can request it for any reason, or are there specific guidelines that you need to seek a deviation from? Like the example I gave you, I'm sure nobody thought of that, but that might be a deviation that somebody would want to apply for because they have one car and they have to go pick up the child and they don't want to have to go back at 9 o'clock and pick the other one. Is that something?
There are current administrative rules that govern deviations, but per the amendments, there are going to be changes to the criteria that they're going to look for. So we're just going to be monitoring that, I think, over the next couple of months and see what they come up with.
So the deviation then could be a broad deviation. You can ask for it. I mean, you might not necessarily get it, but it may not hurt to ask for it.
Yeah, I mean, there are 2 deviations that you absolutely can't ask for or won't be approved for, and that's asking for a minor to work between midnight and 5 a.m. Or in like hazardous conditions like Tony was mentioning earlier.
Are there any industry specific exceptions?
Yeah, you know, if a minor is going to work in like an agricultural setting, right, we're kind of used to that, working on the farm. In the entertainment business, so performance arts, some kids will go out and work for some kind of like community theater or something like that, or a family business. And all those terms are defined pretty clearly in YESA, and that hasn't changed too significantly since the adoption in April.
All right, and the work permit, Tony, can you discuss what's changing with the work permit process itself?
Yeah, so currently, if you're going to go get a work permit, those are issued and revoked by administrators or designees of the minor school district, public school academy, or non-public school. So you got to go get it from your school. The process is that the work permits are kept on file at the place wherever you're going to go work, and in the permanent record with the school. And then on termination of employment, the employer must return the permit back to the school administrator. So beginning 18 months after the effective date of the law, so October 2nd, 2026, responsibility for issuing the work permits is transferred to Leo, as I mentioned. But until that point, schools are still the issuer of the work permits. But after October 2nd, minors must register with Leo before starting work. And then employers are also going to register with Leo, and the student minors have to basically apply and seek registration, and then Leo will issue a work permit in accordance with their new regulations. But the requirements are essentially the same. You need to provide proof of age and some other documentation that they request.
Okay, so up and for the next 18 months, you could still get the permit through the school.
Yep.
I assume you can contact the administration office and they have those available. And then after the 18 months, it's all going to be centralized within Leo.
Yep. Yeah, and the other note I want to make is that Leo is going to have 5 days from the date of submission to issue you that work permit. But it also states in the law that if they don't issue that work permit, you're not prohibited from starting work. So you can start work if there's some delay or if there's any sort of administrative issues that they don't issue the work permit in time, you can start work. Now, if they deny you the work permit for whatever reason, that's a different case. But if you just don't get it back within that 5 days, you're allowed to start.
Okay. And then the process of the registration is the minor registers with Leo, and then does Leo then verify that the employer is in compliance with YESA?
Yep. So there's a number of information that the employers are going to have to provide to Leo to essentially register. And this system is going to be open to the public. You're going to have to provide some documentation so that you get registered on the system. Once you're on there, then students or minors can go and seek a work permit from you. But yeah, the employers are going to be the ones to register, and then minors are also going to have to register through Leo, and then Leo will issue those work permits.
And then you earlier referenced that the director for Leo has 5 days after a minor registers to approve it. The minor can work. What does the director do, or what does Leo do after they get that registration? What happens in that 5-day period? Do they have to get approval from a parent or a guardian?
Yeah, so in that 5-day period, I believe Leo's probably just going to be reviewing the documentation, and then they're going to state whether a deviation was requested and authorized. They're going to approve the work permit or not. And then, immediately following that period, they're going to issue that work permit. And so it should be a seamless process, but you never know with government agencies.
Right. And the parents or guardians, they're on board with this in terms of a minor a very self-starting minor can't apply for do this all on his or her own. They'd have to get their approval from there.
Yep, you got to have parental consent.
So what should employers be doing right now? It went into effect April 2nd.
Yeah, I think employers should put it on their radar that this system is changing, the process is changing, that you're going to have to start registering on Leo. So as we get a little bit closer to October 2026, I don't know when registration will be open, but just keep that on your radar. Look at your internal processes. Make sure that you're in compliance with the standards of YESA that aren't changing. So you're not having someone working hours that they're not permitted to work. Make sure you've got the work permit on file. And I also want to note that this applies to volunteers as well. If you're volunteering at a place that's not a 501c3, there's a carve out for 501c3s. But if you're an unpaid intern or an unpaid volunteer, not at a 501c3, you're also going to have to get a work permit.
Okay, that was kind of along the lines of my next question. Are there any exceptions to the work permit or registration requirements? And a lot of the questions that are popping up on the chat are related to volunteers. Are volunteers required to register?
Yeah, so there's a carve out, for an unpaid volunteer who's working at a 501c3. And I know this comes up in, for some of our municipal clients or library clients where, certain entities, they may not pay taxes for whatever reason, but they also may not necessarily be a 501c3. So, you want to make sure that you fall under that exception. If you we've gotten the question a couple of times about, certain volunteers at libraries, for example. Just take a look at, your entity status, that specific exception. So that's the main exception. Then there's also an exception for certain agricultural tasks and nonprofit work that may also be exempt from permit requirements.
And that would be all spelled out in the statute itself.
Yep.
Courtney, are there any penalties for violating YESA?
Yeah, so surprisingly, again, the legislator did not revise the penalties that are currently in existence, which I think is interesting, but nonetheless, for a majority of the violations of YESA, you're going to be charged with a misdemeanor, right? And that's going to be jail time up to a year, a fine of $500 or both. There's only two specific violations that have been earmarked under YESA, right? And that's for violations of subsections 12A and 14A. So that's for employers who employ minors in like cash transaction occupations, right? And there's like an hourly requirement there too. So if you're employing a minor in a cash transaction occupation between sunset and 8 a.m., that's going to be a violation. And they've earmarked that, interestingly, for 3 different violations. So your first violation, you're going to get a slap on the hand, right? It's a misdemeanor, less than 1 year of jail time, a $2,000 fine or both. If you're guilty of a second offense, the jail time goes up, your fine's going to go up. And then third offense, shame on you, you're going to get jail time of 10 years, a fine of no more than $10,000 or both, right? So a pretty hefty misdemeanor there. The biggest one is, like I said, subsection 114A, and that's abuse of commercial activity. That's an actual criminal violation under the penal code. That's your felony charge, imprisonment of no more than 20 years, a fine of no more than $20,000 or both. So big deterrence there to violate our Michigan penal code, I would say.
Oh, okay. Would that be enforced by the Attorney General's office or a local prosecutor or a county prosecutor?
I believe that would be through the AG's office.
And that would be to the president of the company, or would it be to the HR person that made that decision, or did they make that distinction in the statute?
They have not. There's no distinction that I have found. But I believe it would be the person, the owner of the business. Tony, have you seen anything different than that?
No, they don't specifically carve out that, executives or supervisors, maybe, it personally charged here, but, there are criminal penalties. And so really important that you stay compliant with this.
For sure. Yeah, if a possible felony, that would be a big problem. Record keeping, there are some record keeping requirements, correct, Courtney?
Yeah, just like with any regulation from the state, they require that all employers post all the requirements, right? So there's a handy dandy poster available on the state's website if you need it. I noticed in the comments, somebody was saying that they haven't updated the regulations, and I would agree. I've been checking every day, and I just checked for you as well, and there are no updates, but there will be a poster available if there isn't one right now. So the poster that should go up in a place that's accessible to all of your employees, right? It should be very visible. And then you want to make sure that you are accurately keeping time for your employees. That's for your own safety and protection in case a violation is alleged. That's also for audit purposes, right? If you're dinged by the state and they want to review your records, which they can do, they reserve that right for themselves under the statute. I believe the statute itself requires 1 year of retention of all these documents, but you'll also want to check your internal retention policies. I know from a municipal standpoint, there are separate retention requirements, right? From a private standpoint, that's more discretionary. So make sure that you are reconciling the both. But from a statute perspective, it's a minimum of 1 year. And then from a municipal standpoint, right, a lot of our municipalities or joining us are probably very familiar with FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act. But from a private perspective, many of you might not be. Any information that is released by the employer into the registration system is going to be collected by Leo and put into a separate youth employer database. Information in that youth employer database will be subject to FOIA. So I want to make sure everybody understands that it will be released if Leo receives a public record request relating to that information. So that's just something to be mindful of from a privacy perspective, if you're not used to that regulation.
Are there any best practices that you'd recommend?
I would just echo what Tony was saying in terms of timekeeping and updating policies, right? You want to be really methodical when it comes to this stuff because while the violations didn't change, they are pretty significant, right? And you don't want to be dinged simply because you let it, a minor stay an hour past because maybe they only had one car that day and they were hanging out for their 19-year-old sibling or something. So, be very mindful of your policies, be very strict in enforcement. If there is a need to document it and what the circumstances are to protect yourself from an employer standpoint. And I liked one of Tony's suggestions earlier, assign somebody, designate somebody that you can trust to monitor compliance. If you don't think you have the capability, designate somebody. Those would be my biggest recommendations.
Okay. Before we turn it over to the questions, because there are several, just want to wrap up a little bit. Do either of you have any comments in terms of what are the most important takeaways that you think that everyone should take away from this session?
Yeah, I think there's a few. The big one is that there's now different hour limitations with the amendment, and those are in effect today. They are in effect now. The other is that, we're moving over to a new registration system with Leo. That's not starting until October 2026. So we got a little time there. But it's a good opportunity to make sure that you're compliant with the other portions of the law that haven't changed. And just wanted to highlight that there are serious penalties that come with this. It's criminal. I think the state takes these things really seriously. And then just make sure that you've got your record keeping in place. You're detailed, you're aligned with all of your other wage and hour laws. Like ESTA, we've talked about it a lot, but ESTA always comes up. So make sure you got your record keeping in place.
Courtney, where can employers go for more guidance?
Well, like one of our guests asked, usually you can go to the state's website and find a lot of helpful information there. But I think each employer is unique, right, in terms of how they operate, how they would like to continue to operate. So I would really encourage you to reach out to local counsel about how you're operating and if it is in compliance with YESA and ESTA and all the other complementary statutes, right? Because the last thing you want is to find that one little thing is off in your policies or one little thing is off in terms of how you operate or your record retention. So, not to selfishly plug, but I think legal counsel is always the best first step to prevent any future violations.
Good. Well, let's get to some of the questions. We've got a few more minutes left. And I'm just going to kind of run through them. There's several. One of the questions, what is the name of the new law? And that would be the Youth Employment Standards Act, correct?
Yep.
When will the newly updated work permit be available to schools and employers?
I believe that they're unfolding it right now, but I don't think you're obligated to use it until October 2nd, 2026.
Yep.
Some of these are a little individualized towards particular employers. The question is a good one. What about residential junior camp counselors that live at the camp during the summer months?
Ooh, that could touch on a couple of different carve outs, I think, in the statute. That one might need a little bit more discussion in terms of what their job duties are and their day-to-day functions. But I would be happy to discuss that if you'd like.
Yeah, would that be
I wanna-
a deviation that you would request a deviation for that?
Probably need a deviation, yeah, if it, depending on what the hours are and what the responsibilities are. Because we don't know what the deviation guidance is gonna be under these changes. It's hard to say what will and will not be approved. But yeah, if that person who asked that question would like to talk offline, I'd be happy to address that in a little bit more detail.
One of the questions was a request for a link showing the updated verbiage. We can do that for you easily. The next question is, youth employment laws also apply to volunteer work. Is a work permit required for volunteer hours like those required for National Honor Society, Scouts, and for graduation? It's a good question. They're all good questions. That's a pretty good one.
So there's the carve out for 501c3s. And then there's also a carve out, and I was trying to flip through the statute real quick and find it. But there's a carve out for sort of youth, and I'm butchering the language, but like you know, youth like groups, student groups that have I believe a primarily charitable purpose. I'll find the specific language as we're sitting here. But it's possible that this question might get to that one. Oh, here it is. So section 19 of the statute. So there's a couple carve outs completely. There's, shoe shining, selling newspapers, if you're working at your family business where your family is the primary owner of the business. And then there's also a carve out for services performed as a member of a recognized youth-oriented organization that's engaged in citizenship training and character building. So like Courtney said, I think it would probably be a question on, what is actually being done, what the organization is, what the student or the minor is doing. But that is a potential carve out from the statute.
Thank you. Shoe shining, that's really one of them.
That's one of them.
Oh, yeah.
Guess they didn't modify the statute for that. Currently, do minors who would like to work on a family farm during the summertime need a work permit through their school?
So the farm situation is unique. There are regulations depending on the age. If the minor is 13 to 17, and I'm trying to look at the language to make sure I'm not misspeaking here, they may be employed in farming operations. If they are, if it's before October 2nd, 2026, they can do farming work and things like that at the regular hours during school vacation periods.
Again, an issue related to volunteers. Another question. There are some societies like National Honor Society which require volunteer hours. As a library, we give these kids a good amount of hours. How is this going to be affected? It sounds like this will even affect teens who only volunteer 2 hours a month or even quarterly. So I think this is specific to libraries. How would it affect the library's ability to use give someone service hours for National Honor Society?
Yeah, so I think that brings in that section that I previously read regarding, recognized youth-oriented organizations. I think it also calls the question whether or not the specific library is a 501c3. Some are not. I think I saw a couple comments in there that that said that, hey, we're not a 501c3. Do we need a work permit? We could certainly take a look at that question. I know this comes up, and there's also. I also want to call out another section that you don't need a work permit if you've got a written agreement between the employer and the school. That's an option that employers could have. Now you'd have to be in compliance with all other wage and hour laws and make sure that agreement is enforceable. But to specifically answer your question, that was a long-winded way of saying I don't know without additional detail. It's possible there may be a carve out based on those sections that I referenced, but you know, without getting into the details on what's actually happening, you know, we wouldn't be able to tell right now.
It sounds like if it's a 501c3, you'd probably be okay. It's the question is if you're not a 501c3, there's an issue of what you can provide and whether or not the youth program, whether or not NHS is a youth program.
Right.
So it's probably a narrow issue, and we can certainly follow up on that. How do we know if a minor has filed for the permit or not?
The employer should get a notification through the registration system. Right now through the school districts, it's different administrative regulations, but in the new system, they will automatically get notified.
Okay. Another good question. Who determines school year? We employ homeschool kids, and some are done with their school for the summer while local public schools are still in session. So
That's actually regulated by, that's actually one of the amendments that was made to the statute. So they're going to go by federal definition. And give me 1 second because I can find you the actual citation here. I was just looking at those earlier today as well. So it's 29 CFR 570.35. That's the citation where they actually define school year, outside school hours, etc.
Okay, and that again is 29 CFR what?
29 CFR section 570.35.
All right, thank you. Will minors working at the time of the change with current work permits under the old rules be required to obtain a new work permit through Leo?
That's a good question. I don't know. That might be something that comes up with some of the regulations that come out from the director. I can only imagine that it would be honored until the employee actually leaves that job or something significant changes, like they have to go to a different employer location or something like that.
Yeah, and they might put, you know, we don't have any FAQs or regs on the amendment yet. You know, it's possible that Leo will update that as we get a little closer to, you know, the new system being in place. You know, hopefully they put out some guidance on best practices and things like that. But right now, you know, the guidance is limited as to the amendments.
If a teen turns 18 during their senior year, do these rules still apply to them and their work?
I would say that by the time they hit 18, you know, the rules will probably no longer apply. But if they're in the middle of a job, right, that's regulated by YESA, then it's a matter of communication with their employer, right? And then relaying that information to Leo, because there are, or there is criteria in the statute that was amended that says that when a permit needs to be revoked or suspended or withdrawn, you have to give them notice. So I think that's really probably the only thing that you have to do, which is just going back to the documentation part that Tony and I have been harping on, right? Notify, document, etc., just so you can kind of avoid any violation in the future. Okay.
And the last question was basically, for those that are not familiar, what are the current rules for the 16 or 17-year-olds?
I'm glad somebody asked because I feel like I glazed over that and I'm sorry. So currently, and again, this is not a change. There was no change to this. 16 and 17-year-olds, they can't work more than 6 days a week. They can average about 8 hours a day or up to 48 hours a week. But if they're enrolled in school, they can't exceed 24 hours in a work week. And I think the other regulation is they can't work between the hours of 10:30 p.m. and 6 a.m. Unless it's a Friday or a Saturday or school break. At which point they can work until 11:30 p.m.
Okay. One last question. If a 17-year-old receives their official diploma from high school, does this exempt them from work restrictions?
Not to my knowledge, no.
I don't believe so. I know there was an exemption for someone who obtains their GED, but I don't believe so if they receive their diploma and they're still 17.
All right, that's all the time we have, and those are all the questions. Thanks for everybody. Thanks to everybody for attending today, and thank you, of course, Tony and Courtney, for your very interesting subject. And there's obviously a lot of questions. If anybody wants to follow up, what we'll do is follow up with some of the questions that we were going to based on the contact information that's contained within the chat. And so we can handle those questions for you, because there were some excellent questions that a lot of this stuff hasn't been decided yet by the agency or courts. And so, we'll do our best to give you the response that's most helpful to you. But our next session is June 11th. It's a Wednesday. A topic hasn't been selected yet, but certainly stay tuned to the website and notice, and we'll get out a new topic probably within the next 10 to 14 days. So thanks again for everybody that's attended, and everybody have a nice day.